Mark was not the kind of man who complained often, because life on a deep space station demanded toughness, patience, and the ability to fix things even when they made no sense at all. But today something was different, because the moment he climbed out of the maintenance hatch after 4 hours of crawling, twisting, and floating inside a narrow service duct, something sharp and unforgiving grabbed his lower back like a steel claw, and he let out a painful groan that echoed through the empty corridor of Horizon Edge Station. He tried to stand straight, but his spine refused to cooperate, and with every small movement, the pain jabbed deeper, and he gritted his teeth as he leaned against the nearest wall, pressing his palm to the aching muscle and wondering what he had done to deserve this, especially when all he had wanted was a quiet day to repair the coolant valves and grab a cup of warm synth tea. Afterward, limping slowly toward the crew lounge, Mark was greeted by Lena, who noticed his awkward steps right away and raised one eyebrow before asking what happened, and when he explained, she winced and told him he probably pulled something serious because the gravity shifts in the ductwork could mess with the body in strange ways, and when he shrugged and said he would walk it off, she rolled her eyes and told him that would only make it worse. She suggested he visit the alien therapy unit down in Sector 12, where a therapist from the Tarnic species had recently opened a clinic, and according to several crew members, their treatments were strange but effective, and Mark, who had never trusted alien methods much, shook his head and said he would rather stretch it out and rest in the medbay, but the pain in his back flared again, and he nearly dropped to his knees before finally agreeing with a reluctant sigh. Lena helped him book the session right there, and then with a few taps on her wristband, and told him the therapist's name was Dree, and they had 4 arms which made their techniques fast and precise. And Mark, who was barely listening at that point, just nodded as he rubbed the sore spot on his back and hoped that the alien would be gentle. The walk to Sector 12 felt like a marathon, with every step causing another jolt of discomfort, and by the time he reached the waiting area of the Tarnic clinic, Mark was sweating from the effort and silently praying that this strange 4-armed alien would know what they were doing, because if not, he feared he might end up in traction for the rest of the month. Clinic itself looked nothing like the sterile white halls of the human medical bay, because instead of bright lights and humming machines, the room was filled with soft blue glows, warm air that smelled like sweet herbs, and strange decorations that pulsed gently on the walls as if alive and calming. Music played in the background in a rhythm that almost matched the human heartbeat. A tall figure stepped forward from behind a semi-transparent curtain and greeted him with a smile so wide and cheerful it made Mark nervous, and the alien's voice was smooth and pleasant with perfect pronunciation as they welcomed him and introduced themselves as Dree, certified muscle therapist specializing in interspecies body tension realignment. Mark was too tired to question anything, so he nodded and followed Dree into the therapy chamber, where he was asked to lie down on a cushioned surface that felt like soft jelly. And as he settled in, Dree explained the process in great detail, mentioning gravitational balance, realignment, energy flow modulation, and deep tissue release, but Mark barely absorbed any of it because the moment he lay on his stomach, the pressure in his back seemed to ease just a little, and he thought maybe this might not be so bad after all. But as Dree's 4 hands hovered above him, glowing faintly from the oils they had applied to their fingers, Mark suddenly had a strange feeling that this would be far from a normal treatment session, and though he tried to relax, he could not shake the thought that something unexpected was about to happen, and whatever it was, he had walked right into it without knowing what he had just agreed to. Mark had never felt more uncertain in his life than he did, now lying face down on a strange soft table that molded to his body in ways that were both comforting and slightly suspicious, while the air in the room shifted in temperature every few seconds, as if the walls were trying to read his mood and adjust accordingly. And all the while, the calming alien melody continued playing in the background, with no clear rhythm, no chorus, just endless tones rising and falling like waves on A distant Seedree hovered nearby preparing tools, oils, and strange objects that Mark had never seen before, and the alien hummed softly to themselves in a tune that didn't match the music, but somehow blended with it like a background echo from another world, and Mark turned his head slightly to watch as Dree moved with a kind of graceful energy that didn't seem to match their tall rubbery frame, because with 4 arms, they could do twice as many things at once, and that made Mark feel both impressed and very concerned. Dree spoke in a cheerful tone as they approached, saying that human muscle structure was fascinating, especially because it was built for endurance, rather than sudden bursts of strength, unlike some other species, who relied more on elasticity or bone vibration for movement, and Mark, who didn't entirely understand what Dree meant, gave a small laugh and said something about humans being stubborn, and Dree responded with a nod and said stubbornness often stored itself in the lower back and shoulders, which explained the cramp before Mark could respond. Dree placed all 4 hands on his back and began to press down gently with the kind of pressure that was precise, but not painful, and for a moment, Mark thought maybe this would work, maybe all his doubt had been unnecessary because the warmth of Dree's touch spread through his spine and loosened a few knots that had been buried deep for weeks. Then suddenly something shifted as Dree's hands moved faster and with more strength than Mark had expected, and one of the hands reached up to his shoulder while another reached down to his hip, and the other 2 applied spiraling pressure along his lower back in a synchronized pattern that made Mark's entire body jerk in surprise, and he let out a startled noise that sounded like a mix between a groan and a yelp. Dree paused only for a moment and asked if the sensation was reaching the core of the pain, and Mark, who was still catching his breath, muttered that it felt like something was definitely being reached, and the alien seemed pleased with that response because they immediately resumed their work with even more enthusiasm, as if they had just unlocked a new level of therapy excitement. Mark tried to lift his head to ask if this was normal, but his body was being pushed and pulled in so many directions at once that his words came out like broken sentences, and Dree misinterpreted his concern as a sign of deep muscular resistance, so they introduced a glowing blue oil to the treatment, which had a cooling effect that ran across Mark's skin like icy fire, and he gasped as his muscles twitched involuntarily. At this point, Dree activated a low-gravity field around the table, and suddenly Mark's body began to float slightly, just a few inches off the surface, as Dree used all 4 hands to spin him gently in place, stretching and twisting his limbs in ways that no human physical therapist would ever dare attempt. And though the pain was fading, Mark's mind was filled with flashing thoughts of broken bones, dislocated joints, and permanent back damage. Dree, however, remained cheerful and kept commenting on the flexibility of human joints and the elasticity of tendons, while occasionally mumbling phrases like fascinating and resilient and unusually tight. And Mark, who was now half floating, half spinning, could do nothing but grip the edges of the table and hope that Dree had at least read a manual about human anatomy before trying this kind of madness. The final part of the session involved something Dree called energy line tapping, where they used the tips of their fingers to strike very specific points along Mark's spine in rapid, rhythmic patterns, and every tap caused a strange ripple of sensation to spread through his limbs, making him feel like his nerves were lighting up in sequence. And though it wasn't painful, it was certainly confusing, and Mark began to question whether he was still awake or had fallen into some strange alien dream therapy state. By the end of the session, Mark was covered in oil, his hair sticking to the side of his face, and his back tingling with a mix of relief, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite name. And Dree stepped back and admired their work with pride, announcing that his tension levels had dropped by 72% and recommending another session within 3 days to maintain optimal spinal flow. Mark sat up slowly, his body loose and relaxed, but his brain still spinning, and he looked at Dree with wide eyes and tried to form a sentence that could explain what he had just experienced, but all he could say was that it had been something, and Dree took that as a compliment, bowing politely before reminding him that healing often begins in discomfort, and that pain was sometimes a sign of release. As Mark left the therapy room with legs that felt like jelly and arms that no longer ached, he promised himself never to return, but deep down a small part of him wondered whether that 72% drop in tension might actually be worth a second round. Mark had barely stepped out of the alien clinic when he realized something was not right, because although his back no longer throbbed with sharp pain, his legs moved like they were made of soft rubber, and every step felt like walking through invisible pudding, while his arms swung loosely as if he had no control over them at all. And as he wandered through the corridor of horizon, edged with slow dragging feet, a few crew members looked at him with puzzled expressions, wondering if he was injured or simply sleepwalking through his shift. Lena saw him first from across the corridor and rushed over immediately, her voice full of concern as she asked if the session had gone badly, and Mark tried to explain what happened, but his words came out tangled and strange, like his mouth was still under the effect of alien oils or gravity fields, and he waved his hands in helpless circles before mumbling something about floating spinning oils, tapping pressure, and too many hands at once. And Lena, who had heard some stories before, just shook her head and said that she should have warned him more clearly about the Tarniks and their over-enthusiastic methods. She helped him sit on a bench near the observation window, where the stars outside drifted in slow motion, and the silence of space seemed to laugh gently at his misery, while Mark leaned back and took deep breaths, trying to regain control of his limbs, which still trembled from the treatment. And though his muscles felt lighter, there was a buzzing under his skin that would not fade. Later that day, when he returned to his room, he tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw Dree's smiling face hovering above him, with 4 hands moving in perfect coordination, like a concert of limbs dancing through the air. And every time he thought he had calmed down, he remembered the part where his body floated above the table and spun like a leaf in wind, while his spine was pressed, twisted, tapped, and stretched by hands that knew no rest. The next morning, his shift supervisor noticed his strange walk and distant look and assigned him to light duty, which Mark didn't argue with, because even though the pain was gone, his body felt too loose, like his joints had forgotten how to stay firm. And Lena, who had taken it upon herself to monitor his condition, kept checking his posture, reminding him not to slouch or lock his knees, and every time he tried to protest, she simply raised an eyebrow and reminded him that he had agreed to alien therapy in the first place. By midweek, things started to feel more normal as the strange, jelly-like sensation began to fade, and Mark's muscles adjusted to the post-treatment condition. But just when he thought life had returned to balance, a message appeared on his wrist console with the subject line, "Follow-up therapy session confirmed," and the sender listed as Dree, interspecies therapist, with the time and location already set for the next day. Mark stared at the message for a long moment, debating whether to cancel, ignore, or fake an injury that would excuse him from all treatments. And after a while, he simply sighed and closed the message, thinking he would decide later. But the thought of those 4 arms moving at once haunted him through the evening. The following day, he tried to pretend he had forgotten about the session, but Dree sent a polite reminder, accompanied by a cheerful note that said progress had been made and further release of internal tension was expected. And although every part of Mark's mind screamed no, his body betrayed him by feeling slightly curious whether the strange methods had truly helped more than they harmed. When he arrived once again at the glowing therapy room, the atmosphere was exactly as he remembered: soft lights, pulsing walls, warm air, and music that made his heart slow down before he even lay on the table. And Dree welcomed him with a bright smile, saying they were excited to continue, and that this time they had a new technique to try involving rhythm pressure and something called harmonic adjustment. Mark hesitated before climbing onto the table and asked if this session would be more gentle than the last, and Dree placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and promised to read his body better this time, because therapy was a shared journey and communication was key. And Mark, who had no way to argue with such optimistic words, gave in and let the treatment begin. But almost immediately, he realized the new method was not less intense because as Dree's hands moved with practiced speed, they activated a series of vibration pads under the table that pulsed in time with the pressure, and Mark's body began to resonate with every touch, and though the sensation was not painful, it made him feel like he was becoming part of the music around him, his thoughts bouncing in rhythm with his bones. Dree introduced a strange bell that they rang softly every few minutes and claimed it would align Mark's inner flow with the station's outer frequency, and Mark, who had no idea what that meant, simply nodded and tried not to fall off the table while his muscles danced under the alien hands. Each move was faster than the last, and when all four hands moved in spirals across his arms and back, Mark felt a strange heat rise in his chest, like energy being unlocked or maybe panic being triggered, and he finally blurted out that maybe they should pause for a moment. But Dree took that as encouragement and increased the speed of the technique, saying that the energy was flowing better than expected outside the room. Lena stood near the door, listening to the occasional thumps, gasps, and strange hums coming from inside, and considered whether she should step in or let the session finish, because despite how ridiculous it all sounded, she had to admit, Mark had looked more relaxed and pain-free after the last time, even if he acted like he had gone through a small personal war. And inside the glowing room, Mark floated once again in the soft grip of the gravity field, his limbs stretched gently by alien hands and his thoughts swirling like stardust, trying to remember why he ever thought a simple muscle cramp would lead to something so completely and undeniably bizarre. Mark never imagined that a session meant to fix a small back cramp would turn into the most unpredictable physical experience of his entire spacefaring life, because now he was not just floating again in that softly glowing therapy chamber, but also being spun slowly in midair, while all four of Dree's hands moved in perfect rhythm across his shoulders, spine, and legs, tapping, squeezing, stretching, and pushing him in directions he did not even know his body could bend. And as his limbs swayed like loose branches in wind, he began to accept that things had gone far beyond the limits of ordinary treatment. Dree appeared absolutely delighted, their large eyes full of wonder as they studied every part of Mark's movement with such focus it felt more like an alien research experiment than a massage, and they kept commenting on his increasing flexibility, the unlocking of hidden muscle channels, and something about core alignment that sounded impressive but made very little sense to Mark, who was trying very hard not to scream each time a new stretch pulled his arms away from his body with more force than expected. He had already tried politely asking for a break, suggesting maybe his energy flow needed time to settle, or perhaps his nervous system was overstimulated, but Dree simply smiled with that same cheerful calm and assured him that they were reaching the final phase of complete muscular freedom, which apparently involved a special pressure sequence only used on beings with unusually high resistance levels. And while Mark never saw himself as especially resistant, he suddenly regretted every stubborn moment he had ever shown since birth. The room's lighting shifted colors again, moving from soft blue to gentle gold, and a light hum filled the air like some kind of harmonic signal coming from the walls, and Mark felt his skin tingling as Dree pressed one palm against his upper chest, another against his hip, a third on his lower back, and the fourth reaching under to support his neck. And then all four arms began to work in fast, circular motions that made Mark's vision blur, and his heartbeat race like a drum in his ears. Desperate for an exit, he remembered that during the intake session there had been a question about emergency stops, and a single word listed on the form that would signal the therapist to immediately stop everything. And while he had laughed at the time, thinking no therapy session could ever reach that point, he now saw it as his last possible option, and he tried to remember the word, his mind racing through a storm of sensations and alien phrases until he finally remembered it: banana, with all the Strength left in his lungs, he shouted it not once, but 3 times, hoping it would override whatever enthusiasm Dree had built up over the last hour, and to his immense relief, Dree froze mid-motion, all 4 hands stopping instantly, and their wide eyes blinking in surprise as they floated down slightly, with a puzzled look on their face. They asked gently if he had used the safe word by mistake, or if his body was truly at its maximum threshold, and Mark, who was hanging knitter like a stretched marionette, nodded rapidly and said his core was realigned, his flow was fully unlocked, and his muscles were more free than they had ever been, and Dree paused for a moment as if running an internal diagnostic, then slowly nodded and lowered the gravity field until Mark settled gently back onto the soft jelly surface of the therapy table. His legs felt like noodles, his arms refused to stay still, and his mind was spinning like the outer ring of a transport ship. But the most important thing was that the session was over, or at least paused, and when Dree offered to begin the cool-down phase with something called limb vibration resonance, Mark shot up from the table with what little strength remained and insisted that his body was already vibrating plenty on its own, and more would probably launch him straight out of the airlock. Dree looked slightly disappointed but respected the request and handed Mark a soft towel made from some kind of alien moss that absorbed oil instantly and released a cool wave of refreshing mist that helped his skin calm down. And as Mark wiped his face, arms, and back, trying to remove the strange glowing oils that now seemed a part of him, Dree kindly reminded him that therapy was always more effective when the client remained open to new experiences, and Mark forced a smile that barely hid the deep emotional confusion still swirling inside his soul. Just as he was gathering his things and preparing to walk out of the clinic, Lena arrived at the door with a datapad in hand, looking around the glowing chamber with wide eyes and asking if everything was all right, because she had heard strange sounds again, and Mark just gave her a blank look that said more than any words could express. And when she tried to ask more questions, he raised one hand and simply said, "Next time you try it." Before they left, Dree handed him a small pouch filled with herbal patches that would help stabilize his energy levels over the next few days, and offered another appointment slot in case he wanted to continue his muscle freedom journey. And Mark took the pouch with shaking hands, muttering something that sounded like thanks, but could have also been a cry for help depending on the angle, and then he turned around and walked out of the clinic without looking back. The corridors outside felt colder than before, or maybe it was the sudden absence of swirling oils and glowing lights and 4 enthusiastic arms that made the world seem strangely quiet. And Mark walked slowly, leaning slightly forward like a man trying to remember how gravity and bone structure worked after a very long and complicated dream, and Lena walked beside him, saying nothing at all, for once letting soilless fill the space between their footsteps. They reached the lift back to their quarters. Mark whispered mostly to himself that he just wanted a normal chair, a cup of warm synth tea, and maybe a quiet hour to sit and stare at the wall without anyone talking about alignment, energy waves, or muscle pathways. And Lena nodded in full agreement, though part of her still wondered whether the therapist had unlocked something inside him that human doctors had never touched. Mark would never know for sure, but one thing was clear: the next time he pulled a muscle, he would be sticking to ice packs and human meds, and nothing that involved floating, spinning, tapping, or 4-handed creatures with no concept of personal space. Mark sat alone in the small relaxation chamber beside the hydroponics bay, where artificial plants swayed gently under soft light, and the hum of life support systems gave off a soothing rhythm that helped him forget the wild whirlwind of his recent therapy experience. He leaned back in the recliner, letting his body settle into its natural form again, slowly learning to trust his own muscles, which no longer ached but still felt like they had been through a thunderstorm of force and confusion. He had spent the last 2 days trying to return to his routine, checking maintenance logs, reviewing shift schedules, inspecting coolant systems, and assisting with minor repairs. But no matter how normal the tasks were, there remained a quiet background sensation in his limbs, like echoes of invisible hands pressing, tugging, guiding, and every so often when he closed his eyes, he could still feel that soft gravity lift which had made him float like a feather caught between worlds. Lena had asked him several times whether he planned to file a complaint or at least send feedback to the station council, but Mark had shrugged, each time saying he was not sure whether he had suffered or grown stronger through the process, because despite the mental chaos, he had to admit, his back felt better than it had in years, his joints moved with ease, his reflexes seemed sharper, and even his breathing felt deeper, as if something inside had truly been set free, though he would never admit that to Dree or anyone who might send him back to that glowing chamber. He avoided the Sector 12 hallway whenever possible, taking longer routes just to keep distance between himself and the clinic, and each time he passed the wall display with rotating announcements and new appointment offers, he turned his gaze quickly away, pretending to check something on his wrist console, but deep inside a small spark of curiosity remained, not strong enough to guide his feet back, but stubborn enough to whisper maybe just one more session. One quiet evening, while reviewing system reports in the crew lounge, Mark received another message from Dree, this time more colorful than the last, with animated stars blinking across the top, and a cheerful note saying that the therapist had developed a new personalized method inspired by human physiology, and they would love to offer him free trial to test the balance between internal resonance and external gravitational freedom. Mark stared at the message for a long time, his finger hovering over the reply button, and for a moment he imagined himself agreeing again, walking through the glowing doorway, floating above that soft table, while 4 hands danced over his body with perfect rhythm. But then he remembered the spinning, the oil, the safe word, and the way he had walked out like a limp noodle with his dignity barely attached. And he slowly closed the message without replying. Instead, he walked toward the viewing deck, where stars shimmered beyond the glass wall like tiny diamonds scattered across a velvet sheet, and he stood there quietly, letting his thoughts drift, and remembering that humans had come a long way through space, not just with engines and machines, but with something deeper, the ability to adapt to the strange, the patience to face the unknown, and the stubborn courage to laugh at their own pain. He realized then that maybe this was what humanity's place in the galaxy really meant, not just being strong or smart, but being brave enough to lie on an alien therapy table and let someone with 4 arms realign your spine while singing in 3 tones and calling it healing. In the days that followed, Mark returned fully to his duties, his steps more confident, his back perfectly straight, and his expression a little calmer than before. And when crew members asked him how he had recovered so fast from such a nasty cramp, he would pause, smile slightly, and say it was a very long story, one that involved 0 boundaries, a lot of unexpected techniques, and a lesson he would never forget about the limits of comfort and the strange shapes of relief. Eventually, Dree's messages stopped coming, and the clinic continued serving other clients who left with mixed expressions, some amazed, others confused, but all changed in some way. And though Mark never returned, he found himself once in a while walking near that hallway, pausing just for a moment near the glowing sign, breathing in the faint scent of herbs that lingered in the air, and shaking his head before walking away with a quiet chuckle, because the truth was simple: his pain was gone, his body was healed, and somewhere deep inside, he knew that despite the madness it had worked, and in a place full of stars where nothing stayed the same, that strange, unforgettable experience had become one small, unforgettable story in the great human adventure through the galaxy. The end.